What's going on, everybody? I'm back with another video. This video is going to be looking at Chelsea versus Norwich. Chelsea ended up winning the match by a score of 7-0 in the English Premier League. And before we look at the tactics behind how that happened, be sure to check out both my books. They're online, they're on Amazon, and there's links in the description below. Also, be sure to check out Keyframe. I'm doing a promotion with them, so now anyone who signs up with Keyframe in the link in the description will get a free copy of my book. So be sure to take advantage of that if you're interested in making content. But let's get into the tactics of the match. Chelsea lined up with their usual structure in possession with a back three using 3 central defenders, Thiago Silva at the base of that, and then the holding midfielders in front of them are Kovacic and Jorginho playing as a double pivot, but having a lot of staggering moving into the vacant half space to either side of these 2 holding midfielders. Then we started to see a new trend from Chelsea in this match, and that was using the inverted wingbacks. So Reece James and Ben Chilwell would often invert to come into the half space to create a asymmetric 3 or a midfield box using 4 players, of which would include an inverted fullback and potentially inverted winger dropping deeper or inside forward. Now in the first half, when Norwich went wrong, they went with 2 central forwards in a 5-3-2 system with a very man-oriented midfield that had a narrow starting structure. So they looked to take away the double pivot using man orientation of their midfield 3, and they used to block the central defenders in the wide area of Chelsea. They used their cover shadows of their 2 forwards to block direct access to their wide central defenders, but with the man orientation marking from the goal side of the double pivot and the cover shadows trying to take out the use of their wide central defenders in the half space. Oftentimes we would see links being made through the double pivot of Chelsea and then exploiting a third man concept, or just using these players as links to then have outlets through the half space via their central defenders. Also, this trend could be seen higher up the field with the fullbacks inverting, as we see Reece James did, and the man orientation of the midfield 3 left a lot of space between the lines, which they could then take advantage of via their narrow front 3. So now we see from Norwich a out-and-out 5-3-2 with the 2 forwards looking to have their starting position be between their most central defender and their wide central defenders as well, looking to then block access to the wide center backs and force the ball into the man-oriented midfield, or set up a central pressing trap around Kovacic. Again, Chelsea was able to use the half space to break this pressing scheme or the defensive strategy of Norwich, and they would do so in multiple different ways. So sometimes they would use their central defender, but in this case, when their central defenders were very narrow, as we see here, the solution would come from someone higher up the field. So in this case, we see Jorginho becoming a free player between the lines, and with the central midfielder being drawn further forward to Kovacic, we can see the opportunity created with Jorginho and the double pivot staggering. And this is a common movement from these 2 players as they play together very often. And we often see them switch between going with an out-and-out double pivot and then a single pivot with one of them going higher in space between the lines. And if Jorginho is able to read the orientation of this near side central midfielder being drawn to Kovacic, the single pivot, he then becomes the free player with pinning from his wingbacks and then his more advanced forwards higher up the field. And from here, the ball could access Jorginho via a quick pass through the Kovacic, the holding midfielder, or around the 2 forwards via Rudiger. We see the 5-3-2 again from Norwich, and the back 3 of Chelsea. Being able to find these 2 players of Chelsea, the holding midfielders, became very easy, especially when these players dropped a little deeper in line with the 2 forwards of Norwich, because then we see the midfielders didn't step up and jump that far up the field. So if they were able to drop into a deeper position, collect the ball in line with the first line of pressure from Norwich, we'd then see a big potential being created with players becoming free in different ways higher up the field. one of which was the inverted fullback or inverted wingback in the case of Chelsea. So Ben Chilwell coming in off the wide area. We have the wingback then being pinned by Callum Hudson-Odoi, fading into the wide area, and then Havertz and Mason Mount occupying the last line and pinning the players further forward. But with Ben Chilwell coming in off the wide area, this causes an unusual shifting from Norwich, and now the wingback who would usually track Chilwell is then being pinned by the wide positioning of Callum Hudson-Odoi, allowing Chilwell to be free in the half space and orienting himself to Jorginho, the ball carrier, in a diagonal fashion, allowing for efficient reception of the ball and allowing him to make goal-oriented actions when he does receive the ball. And we can see on the weak side the asymmetry within their team, Reece James occupying the wide area, and then Mason Mount or Kai Havertz occupying the half space, or they could even overload the left-hand side to have more effective pinning, ensuring that Ben Chilwell remains the free player. Now we see Norwich start to press a little higher with a little bit more intensity, and we go with the man orientation through the midfield, which gives them a spare player against the holding midfielders of Chelsea, which would then incentivize them to jump and be attracted to the first line of build-up from Chelsea. And Jorginho dropping into this space, he's very good at linking up play between defenders, being the third man and laying the ball back. So he was very good at reading the situation, and if the press came too early, he could easily break through the half space and create dangerous chances going forward. Or he could then emphasize the pressure and the amount of numbers Norwich committed higher up the field, which would then overextend the space between the lines and make it easier for the more advanced players. So a third man concept with Jorginho here would further attract the jumping midfielder of Norwich and create more space to play further forward. And with the tight connections in the first line and increased space between the lines, even if Chelsea had to go direct, there'd be a good chance they'd be able to win the second ball, but more often than not, especially in the first half, they were able to find these first line and second line passing options as links into the space between the lines where they would find an inverted wingback or a narrow forward. Now we can look at some ways that Chelsea created some of their goals against the last line of Norwich's defense, their 5-man back line and their 3-man midfield. So after we see Chelsea progressing the ball via their double pivot against the two forwards of Norwich, we then start to see Rudiger driving into the midfield, attracting the midfielder of Norwich, allowing then more space around the double pivot. We have a wide fullback via Ben Chilwell, pinning the wing-back of Norwich into the wide area and allowing isolation to occur against one of the central defenders of Norwich and forcing this player to jump higher between the lines, which would promote the use of a double movement to take advantage of this high positioning of the central defender and allow for exploiting of the space in behind to occur. We often see the midfielders being influenced by the inverted wingback of Reece James, using their cover shadows to block access to this player on the weak side. But the biggest key here is the double movement and the dropping of Callum Hudson-Odoi in the half space, creating the space in behind, and then the double movement to access this space with vision from Kovacic to then exploit the space and the movement of Callum Hudson-Odoi. Now there was a big tactical change for Norwich in the second half, and that was the complete change of their defensive formation in their first two lines of pressure. So instead of a 5-3-2, they went with a 5-2-3, and this allowed them to have better access to the first line of pressure and defensive roles against the double pivot that were much more clear. So by going with two holding midfielders themselves, they matched the build-up structure of Chelsea with very simple and very clear defensive shifting roles. So now we see the strategy of Chelsea start to change. So now instead of using more narrow, wide center backs, the center backs almost go into the wide area itself. And what this did, it increased the space the wide wingers of Norwich had to go and travel in order to press these players. So this allowed them to use the external part of the half space to progress further up the field and progress around the mid-block of Norwich and find superiority in wider areas. And we can see this shape very clearly. When Norwich didn't become overly compact in more advanced positions in their defensive phase, they often were able to create good access to the Chelsea first and second line of build-up, which forced Chelsea to play direct. And for the first 10-15 minutes of the second half, Chelsea looked to struggle to find solutions consistently against the Norwich team. So in the build-up, Chelsea's asymmetry and overloading the right side of the field didn't affect the press, as the players would remain with their clear reference points. Each of the front three would press one of the central defenders, and at the same time, they would take away Jorginho as an option or attempt to using a cover shadow, but they would then be covered by the central midfielder jumping and creating access toward Jorginho if Jorginho was able to use a blindside movement and become free. Now, for the last picture, we'll look at some of the Norwich build-up tendencies, and they also went with a back three much like Chelsea, and a double pivot, which often dropped to try and create tight connections in the first and second line, but where they differed is they created an asymmetric midfield three, using their third midfielder, and tried to look to create pinning using their two forwards, while also giving them more options to go more direct if the Chelsea press became too intense and build-up looked like it was going to be isolated. And that's going to wrap up the analysis. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.